Marina shifted uncomfortably in her chair as her father-in-law Richard made another pointed comment about the peculiar odor in the room. Her father, Robert, sat quietly at the end of the dining table, his weathered hands folded on the mahogany surface, his flannel shirt showing years of wear. The Philadelphia suburbs stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, autumn leaves dancing in the October wind. Her mother-in-law Patricia covered her nose with a linen napkin, exchanging knowing glances with Richard. Marina's husband David avoided eye contact, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his dinner plate. Robert had arrived that afternoon from his small workshop in rural Pennsylvania, bringing with him the scent of motor oil and sawdust that clung to his clothes like a second skin. Patricia had immediately suggested he might want to freshen up, her tone dripping with condescension that made Marina's stomach clench. Richard had been less subtle, muttering about proper hygiene and respect for other people's homes as he poured himself another glass of expensive wine. Marina watched her father's expression remain unchanged. That same peaceful smile he'd worn through decades of building something nobody in this room understood. She wanted to scream, to defend him, but the words stuck in her throat like shards of glass. The tension thickened as Patricia served the main course, her movements deliberate and theatrical, placing each plate as far from Robert as the table allowed. Richard launched into a story about his recent promotion at the investment firm, his voice booming with self-importance that filled every corner of the formal dining room. David nodded along enthusiastically, joining his father in painting pictures of wealth and success that seemed designed to diminish Robert's quiet presence. Marina noticed her father's slight smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, and she recognized that look from her childhood. It was the expression he wore when he knew something others didn't, when he was 3 steps ahead in a game they didn't realize they were playing. Patricia finally addressed Robert directly, asking in a tone sweet as poisoned honey what exactly he did for a living in that little workshop of his. The question hung in the air like a trap, waiting to spring, and Marina felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Robert took a slow sip of water, set down his glass with care, and began to speak in his unhurried way about fixing things, about understanding how machines worked. Richard interrupted with a condescending chuckle, saying that manual labor was admirable, but hardly the path to real success in America. Patricia agreed, suggesting that perhaps at his age, Robert might consider retiring to somewhere more appropriate for someone of his means. Marina's hands trembled as she gripped her fork, watching her father absorb their insults like a stone weathering a storm. She thought about calling them out, about revealing the truth she'd kept hidden at her father's request since marrying into this family of presumptuous wealth. But Robert had asked her to wait, to let things unfold naturally, and she'd promised him that patience even though it was killing her now. David reached under the table and squeezed her hand, a gesture she couldn't quite read. Was it support, or a warning to stay silent? The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times, each note seeming to count down to something Marina both dreaded and anticipated. Robert finally set down his napkin and cleared his throat, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made everyone pause mid-bite. He thanked Patricia for the lovely meal and Richard for the enlightening conversation about success, his words delivered without a trace of sarcasm, though Marina heard the steel underneath. Then he reached into his worn jacket pocket and pulled out his phone, placing it on the table with a gentle tap that somehow commanded absolute attention. He explained that he'd received an interesting call that afternoon, just before driving over, from his financial advisor about a situation requiring his immediate decision. Patricia and Richard exchanged confused glances while David's fork clattered against his plate, and Marina finally allowed herself a small smile. Robert's financial advisor had called about a merger opportunity, one that would expand his manufacturing empire into 3 additional states by the end of the fiscal year. He spoke casually about the decision to acquire a competitor's facilities, mentioning figures that made Richard choke on his wine and Patricia's face drain of color. Marina watched her in-laws' expressions transform from condescension to confusion, then to dawning horror as the numbers her father mentioned climbed higher and higher. David's hand tightened around hers under the table, his palms suddenly clammy with sweat that spoke of recognition and regret. Robert continued speaking as if discussing the weather, explaining how his little workshop had grown over 40 years into something most people never saw. The worn flannel shirt and oil-stained hands suddenly took on new meaning in the shocked silence that followed. Robert's casual revelations about his business, Patricia's mouth opened and closed like a fish, gasping for air, unable to form words that might salvage the evening's earlier cruelty. Richard set down his wineglass with shaking hands, the expensive Bordeaux suddenly tasting like ash in a mouth that had been so quick to judge. Robert explained that he'd always believed in living simply, in keeping close to the work that built his fortune rather than surrounding himself with luxury. He'd worn these same clothes to billion-dollar negotiations, had walked into boardrooms smelling of honest labor, and had never apologized for it. Marina felt tears prickling at her eyes, pride swelling in her chest for this man who'd raised her to value substance over appearance. David finally found his voice, stammering an apology that sounded hollow even to Marina's ears. Too little and far too late to erase the evening's contempt. Robert waved it away with the same grease-stained hand they'd all recoiled from earlier, his generosity somehow making their behavior seem even more shameful. He mentioned that he'd planned to discuss a wedding gift tonight, something substantial he'd wanted to give Marina and David to help them start their future. Patricia perked up at this, greed momentarily overriding her embarrassment, her eyes calculating the potential value of Robert's generosity. But Robert's next words cut through that hope like a blade through silk, sharp and absolutely final in their quiet delivery. The wedding gift had been a trust fund, Robert explained, already established and waiting to be transferred into Marina and David's names that very week. $5 million, he said, enough to buy a home, start a business, secure their children's education when the time came for grandchildren. Richard's face turned an alarming shade of purple as he realized the magnitude of what his contempt had potentially cost his son. Patricia actually gasped aloud, her hand flying to her throat, where diamonds sparkled, suddenly seeming cheap compared to the fortune being discussed. Robert paused, letting the weight of that number settle over the table like fog rolling in from the Delaware River outside. Then he added the word that changed everything, the single syllable that made Marina's heart sink, even as she understood its necessity. However, Robert continued, he'd spent the afternoon reconsidering whether this family truly aligned with the values he'd tried to instill in his daughter throughout her life. He'd built his empire on respect, on treating every person with dignity regardless of their appearance or the dirt under their fingernails. This evening had shown him something troubling about the household his only child had married into, something that made him question the wisdom of entangling his hard-earned wealth. Marina felt David's hand slip from hers as her husband processed the implications, watched her in-laws' faces cycle through denial, anger, and desperate calculation. Robert's phone buzzed on the table, a reminder lighting up the screen about tomorrow's board meeting where he'd finalize that multi-state expansion, where decisions affecting thousands of jobs would be made. He would make his final decision about the trust fund by week's end, Robert announced, rising from his chair with the same unhurried grace he'd shown all evening. The smell of motor oil and honest work rose with him, no longer something to mock, but a reminder of everything they'd misunderstood about true wealth. Patricia lurched to her feet, apologies tumbling from her lips in a desperate stream. But Robert simply smiled that knowing smile and thanked her again for dinner. Richard remained frozen, his earlier booming confidence shattered into silence as he calculated exactly how much his condescension had cost in dollars and cents. Marina stood too, moving to her father's side, feeling the comfortable weight of his arm around her shoulders as he kissed her forehead. David called out as they moved toward the door, but Marina didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge the panic in her husband's voice. The drive back to Robert's hotel passed in comfortable silence, the Philadelphia skyline glittering against the October night as father and daughter sat with their own thoughts. Marina finally asked if he was really going to withhold the trust fund, her voice small in the leather interior of the rental car. Robert was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands steady on the wheel as they crossed the Schuylkill River, lights reflecting off the dark water below. He admitted he hadn't decided yet. That part of him wanted to teach a harder lesson, but another part remembered being young and making mistakes. The important thing, he said, was whether David would stand up to his parents now, whether Marina's husband would defend the choices he'd made in choosing her. That would tell Robert everything he needed to know about the man his daughter had married and the family she'd joined. Marina's phone exploded with messages before they even reached the hotel, David's texts arriving in rapid succession, each more frantic than the last. Her in-laws were having what David called a complete meltdown, Richard raging about disrespect while Patricia wept over the potential loss of such a generous gift. David himself seemed caught between defending his parents and acknowledging their terrible behavior, his messages vacillating between apology and subtle blame. Marina stared at the screen, watching the words pile up, and felt something shift inside her like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement. She'd spent 2 years of marriage making herself smaller, quieter, more acceptable to the Thornton family's standards of propriety and class. Tonight had ripped away the curtain to reveal exactly what they thought of where she came from and who had raised her. Robert walked her to the hotel lobby, refusing her offer to come up and talk more, saying she needed time alone to think about what came next. He reminded her that money was just paper and numbers and accounts, that what mattered was building a life with someone who respected her fully. His flannel shirt still carried that familiar scent of the workshop, and Marina found herself hugging him tighter than she had in years. She'd been embarrassed earlier when Patricia first wrinkled her nose, had felt a flush of shame at her father's appearance in this world of polished surfaces. Now that shame transformed into something else entirely, a fierce, protective love mixed with anger at herself for ever doubting him. Robert promised to call tomorrow after his meetings, reminding her that whatever she decided, he'd support her completely, trust fund or no trust fund. The Uber ride back to the house she shared with David felt endless. Every red light a small eternity where Marina replayed the evening's events in excruciating detail. She remembered Richard's contemptuous muttering, Patricia's theatrical disgust, and worst of all, David's silence when his parents had been cruelest. Her husband had sat there, had allowed his family to insult the man who raised her, who worked himself to exhaustion to give her every opportunity. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the windshield as they pulled into the driveway of their modest townhouse in Queen Village. Modest by Thornton standards anyway, though her father had quietly paid the down payment. Another secret she'd kept at David's request because he'd wanted to appear self-sufficient to his family. David was waiting in the living room, still dressed in his dinner clothes, his face haggard in the lamplight as Marina let herself in. He started talking immediately, words tumbling over themselves about his parents' behavior being inexcusable, about how shocked he was by her father's revelations. But Marina noticed what he didn't say, didn't hear an apology for his own silence, for his complicity in letting the cruelty continue unchecked. She set her purse down carefully, bought herself a moment to breathe before responding, knowing that what she said next would set the course for everything. Outside their window, Philadelphia hummed with its usual Tuesday night energy. Cars passing, distant sirens, the city indifferent to the small domestic drama unfolding in this particular townhouse. David reached for her hand and she let him take it, feeling the difference between his soft palm and her father's calloused one. They talked until 3 a.m, Marina's words coming slowly at first, then faster as 2 years of swallowed feelings finally found their voice. She told David about every small cut, every condescending comment his family had made about her background. Her father's work, her state school education, he'd dismissed them as jokes before, had told her she was too sensitive. But tonight had proven they were never jokes at all. David defended himself weakly, saying he'd been caught off guard, that he hadn't wanted to create conflict at a family dinner. Marina asked him point blank when he planned to create conflict, when standing up for her would finally be worth the discomfort of disagreeing with Richard and Patricia. The question hung between them like smoke, and in David's hesitation, in the way his eyes slid away from hers, Marina found her answer. She told him she needed space, needed time to figure out if this marriage could survive the fault lines tonight had revealed beneath its surface. David's face crumbled, panic replacing the careful control he usually maintained, and he begged her not to make rash decisions based on one bad evening. But Marina was tired, bone-tired in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, tired of being the one who always accommodated and adjusted. She moved through their bedroom like a ghost, packing a bag with essentials while David followed, still talking, still trying to logic his way out of accountability. The October dawn was just beginning to lighten the sky when Marina called another Uber, this one taking her to her friend Jessica's apartment in Fish. David stood in the doorway watching her leave, and Marina wondered if he finally understood that some things, once broken, couldn't be fixed with apologies alone. Jessica opened her door at 6 a.m. without questions, just pulled Marina inside and put the kettle on for tea like she'd been expecting this. She probably had been, Marina realized, thinking of all the times she'd downplayed her in-laws' behavior, all the excuses she'd made over coffee at their weekly brunches. They sat at Jessica's small kitchen table as sunrise painted the room gold, and Marina told her everything while Jessica listened with the kind of attention that felt like absolution. Her friend had never liked the Thorntons, had bitten her tongue for 2 years out of respect for Marina's choices, but now the floodgates opened. Jessica recounted moments Marina had forgotten, instances where David had chosen his parents' comfort over his wife's dignity, a pattern so clear in retrospect it seemed impossible she'd missed it. Robert called at 9, his voice steady and grounding even over the phone, asking if she was all right and where she'd spent the night. Marina assured him she was safe at Jessica's, that she and David had talked, that she'd asked for space to think things through properly. Her father was quiet for a moment, then said something that made Marina's eyes well up with tears she'd been holding back since leaving her house. He told her that the trust fund had always been for her, not for David or his family's approval, and nothing about last night changed his desire to help his daughter build a secure future. Whether she stayed married or not, whether the Thorntons ever apologized or not, Robert wanted her to have independence and options. That gift, he said, was about loving her, not about controlling her choices or teaching lessons to people whose opinions ultimately didn't matter. The news of Robert's wealth spread through the Thornton family like wildfire over the next few days. cousins and aunts suddenly calling David with questions and barely concealed excitement. Marina watched from Jessica's apartment as her phone lit up with messages from David's relatives, who'd barely acknowledged her existence at the wedding 2 years ago. Patricia called 3 times before Marina finally answered, her mother-in-law's voice syrupy with forced warmth as she suggested lunch to talk through this misunderstanding. Richard left a voicemail that managed to apologize without actually admitting fault, his words carefully chosen by someone used to negotiating his way out of responsibility. David himself appeared at Jessica's door on Thursday evening, flowers in hand. With a speech he'd clearly rehearsed about growth and change in family therapy, Marina listened to David's promises while autumn rain streaked Jessica's windows. Philadelphia's October weather matching the gray uncertainty in her heart. He wanted to make things right, wanted to prove he could be the husband she deserved, wanted another chance to stand up to his parents' snobbery. The words sounded genuine, and Marina wanted to believe them, wanted to believe that one terrible evening could be a catalyst for real change. But she kept remembering his silence at that dinner table, the way he'd looked away while his parents had mocked her father. She kept hearing Robert's words about respect being foundational, about not building a life with someone who only defended you when there was money on the line. David's flowers were beautiful, expensive roses that probably cost more than her father's flannel shirt, but they felt hollow somehow, purchased rather than grown. She told David she needed more time, watched disappointment and frustration flash across his face before he controlled his expression into understanding. He left the flowers anyway, and after he'd gone, Jessica quietly composted them without asking, an act of solidarity that made Marina laugh for the first time in days. That weekend, Marina drove out to her father's workshop in rural Pennsylvania, needing the comfort of familiar surroundings and the wisdom of the man who'd always seen her most clearly. The workshop sat on 5 acres of land that had belonged to Robert for 30 years, unremarkable buildings that housed the heart of a manufacturing empire. Inside, the smell of motor oil and sawdust wrapped around Marina like a blanket, and her father looked up from an engine he was personally rebuilding, his smile warm and completely free of judgment. They worked side by side for hours, Robert teaching her the same patience with machinery that he'd tried to teach her about life, the way problems revealed themselves if you didn't rush. Marina found herself talking while her hands learned the rhythm of assembly, words flowing easier here than they had anywhere else. She told her father about David's promises, about her own confusion, about not knowing if she was being too harsh or not harsh enough. Robert listened more than he spoke, occasionally asking questions that made Marina examine her own feelings more closely. As afternoon faded to evening and the Pennsylvania hills turned purple with dusk, Marina felt something settle inside her. Not answers exactly, but a clearer sense of what questions actually mattered. Robert made them dinner in the small apartment above the workshop, simple food that tasted better than any elaborate meal Patricia had ever served. Over pasta and salad, he told Marina stories she'd never heard about building his business, about the people who'd underestimated him and the ones who'd seen past appearances to the substance underneath. He'd met her mother in this very workshop, he said, when she'd come to have her car repaired and had stayed to argue about engine design. She'd never cared that he was covered in grease, had loved him for the way his mind worked and the gentleness of his oil-stained hands. Marina felt her mother's absence like a physical ache, wishing she could ask her advice, but Robert seemed to sense it and squeezed her hand across the table. Her father told her that he'd made his decision about the trust fund, and Marina's breath caught, unsure what she wanted him to say. Robert explained that he was going forward with it, the full $5 million, but with one modification to the original plan. Instead of a joint account with David, the trust would be in Marina's name alone, giving her complete control over how it was used. If she and David stayed together and she wanted to share it, that would be her choice, but the security would be hers regardless. Marina felt tears spilling over, understanding the profound gift this represented beyond the money itself. The message that her father believed in her judgment and her strength. He was giving her wings, not strings, and trusting her to fly in whatever direction felt right. Monday morning found Marina back in Philadelphia, standing outside the townhouse she'd left 5 days earlier, her key feeling heavy in her hand. David had texted that he'd taken the day off work, wanting to talk when she was ready, and Marina supposed ready was relative. She let herself in to find the house immaculate, David clearly having stress cleaned every surface until it gleamed. He'd prepared coffee the way she liked it, had her favorite muffins from the bakery on South Street, small gestures that were both touching and inadequate. They sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd argued until 3 a.m. last Tuesday, and Marina told him about her father's decision regarding the trust fund. David's face went carefully neutral, and Marina watched him process that the money would be hers alone. His response to the news about the trust fund would tell Marina everything she needed to know. and she waited in the heavy silence that followed her announcement. David's jaw worked for a moment, emotions flickering across his face, too quickly to read, before he finally spoke. He said he understood why Robert had made that decision, that his family's behavior had been unforgivable and had rightfully damaged their trust. But Marina heard something underneath his words, a careful tone that suggested he was saying what he thought she wanted to hear rather than what he actually felt. She pressed him, asking directly how he felt about the money being solely in her name, and in his hesitation, in the brief flash of resentment before he controlled it, Marina saw the truth. David had counted on that trust fund as theirs, had already been planning how they'd use it, and being cut out stung his ego more than he wanted to admit. They talked for 3 hours, circling around the fundamental question of whether David's love for Marina was separate from the financial security she now represented. He insisted it was, grew frustrated when she kept probing, accused her of being unfair and judging him for normal human reactions. Marina acknowledged that, yes, she was judging him. That judgment was necessary when deciding if a marriage could survive its first real crisis. She told him about her mother, about the story her father had shared, about loving someone for who they were rather than what they represented. David argued that Marina was romanticizing her parents' relationship, that real life required practical considerations about money and family and social standing. His words hung between them, and Marina realized they were speaking different languages, built from different foundations that might never quite align. By Wednesday, Marina had made her decision, the clarity she'd found in her father's workshop solidifying into certainty that felt both terrifying and right. She told David she wanted a separation, not divorce yet, but real space to see if he could grow into the man she needed him to be. His parents' behavior had been a symptom of a larger disease, she explained, a value system that measured worth in bank accounts and pedigrees. She needed to know if David could reject that system, could build different priorities, and she couldn't know that while still living in the middle of their shared life. David tried again to negotiate, to promise change, but Marina was done with promises, needed to see actions sustained over time before she could trust them. She would stay at Jessica's for now. They would attend couples therapy if he was willing, and they would revisit things in 6 months. The practical work of separation was exhausting, dividing belongings and establishing boundaries while raw emotions made everything harder than it needed to be. David's family had their own reactions. Patricia calling Marina directly to beg her to reconsider. Richard sending a stiff email about the importance of forgiveness. The Thornton relatives who'd suddenly taken interest after learning of Robert's wealth now retreated just as quickly, their messages tapering off when it became clear Marina wasn't interested in playing happy family. Only David's younger sister Melissa reached out with genuine concern, apologizing for her parents and admitting she'd always thought they were too harsh. Marina appreciated the gesture, filed it away as evidence that not everyone in David's family was irredeemable, but she still needed distance to figure out her own path forward. Marina threw herself into work at the nonprofit where she managed community programs. Finding purpose in helping others navigate their own difficult transitions, her father's trust fund sat untouched in her account, a safety net she didn't need to use but felt grateful to have. She started therapy alone, working through her tendency to accommodate others at the expense of her own needs. Understanding how she'd let the Thorntons' judgment slowly erode her sense of self, Jessica became her anchor, reminding her on hard days that asking for respect wasn't asking for too much. The Philadelphia autumn deepened into November, leaves falling and temperatures dropping, the city cycling through its seasons while Marina figured out how to trust her own voice again. David attended 3 therapy sessions before his attendance became sporadic, always with plausible excuses about work or family obligations that revealed his true priorities. The therapist gently pointed out that change required consistent effort, that David's pattern of engagement mirrored his pattern during their marriage. Marina watched her husband make the same promises he'd made before, saw him default to the same behaviors when challenged. He'd stand up to his parents for a week, then slowly slide back into old dynamics, choosing comfort over conflict every time. By December, as Philadelphia prepared for Christmas, Marina knew in her bones that her marriage was over, that David was who he'd always been and wishing wouldn't make him different. The knowing hurt, but less than she'd expected. Grief mixed with relief, like snow mixed with rain. She filed for divorce in January. 2 months ahead of the 6-month deadline, she'd set herself unable to see the point in prolonging something that had already ended. David seemed almost relieved too, no longer having to maintain the exhausting pretense of transformation he'd never really wanted. They divided their assets fairly. The townhouse sold. The proceeds split down the middle despite Robert's contribution to the down payment. Marina didn't want anything that would tie her to the Thorntons or give them ammunition to claim she'd been after money all along. Her father's trust fund remained her foundation, but she took pride in supporting herself, in building a life that was authentically hers rather than a compromise between conflicting values. The divorce was finalized by early spring, the paperwork transforming Marina from wife to ex-wife with bureaucratic efficiency that felt anticlimactic. Patricia sent one final message. A passive-aggressive note about disappointed hopes and Marina's inability to forgive, easily deleted. Richard didn't reach out at all, and Marina counted that as a blessing. One less person she'd have to perform gratitude for. David moved on quickly, dating someone from his social circle within months, and Marina felt nothing but a distant wish that he'd find happiness with someone who wanted the life he offered. She kept in touch with Melissa, David's sister, proving to be a genuine friend who'd also been damaged by growing up in the Thornton household and was working to build different values. The connection felt like salvaging something good from the wreckage. Proof that families weren't monolithic and people could choose their own paths. Robert came to Philadelphia more frequently that spring, taking Marina to dinner at hole-in-the-wall restaurants that served incredible food in unremarkable settings. They'd laugh about Patricia's horror at such establishments, about how the Thorntons equated expensive with good and missed so much beauty in their narrow focus. Her father admitted that part of him had wanted to humiliate Richard and Patricia more thoroughly, to use his wealth as a weapon, but he'd realized they'd humiliated themselves far more effectively. The best revenge, he said, was Marina's happiness and freedom. Watching her become more fully herself outside the constraints of that marriage, they'd toast with cheap beer or excellent wine depending on the restaurant, and Marina would feel grateful for genes that had given her this man's values, along with his eyes. She started dating again in summer, cautiously at first, hyper-aware of red flags she'd missed with David and determined not to repeat patterns. Marina met Alex at a community garden project. Their hands dirty from planting vegetables for a food bank program, neither of them ran but both volunteered for it. Alex was a teacher, pragmatic and kind with calluses from weekend carpentry projects and zero interest in impressing anyone. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, and Marina felt something unfold in her chest that she'd almost forgotten. The ease of being with someone who liked her exactly as she was. Alex met Robert 3 months in, the two of them bonding over a shared appreciation for how things worked and the satisfaction of fixing broken objects. Marina watched them rebuild a lawnmower together in Robert's workshop, both covered in grease, both completely content, and felt pieces of her life clicking into place. By autumn, a full year after that disastrous dinner that had changed everything, Marina found herself reflecting on the strange gift Patricia and Richard's cruelty had been. Their contempt had forced issues into the open that might have festered for years, had given her permission to demand more from her relationships. She'd lost a marriage but gained herself back, had learned that love without respect was just another form of slow erosion. Robert's billions remained mostly irrelevant to her daily life, his real gift being the example of integrity over image, substance over surface. She still lived modestly, still worked at the nonprofit, still found her deepest satisfaction in helping others navigate difficult transitions. The trust fund sat there like a promise, security if she needed it, options when opportunities arose, but not the definition of her worth. Jessica threw Marina a divorce anniversary party that October, a celebration of survival and growth with their closest friends gathered in Jessica's apartment. They ate pizza and drank champagne. An intentional mixing of high and low that would have horrified the Thorntons and made Marina laugh. Someone asked if she'd heard from David lately, and Marina realized she hadn't thought about him in weeks, that he'd become just another person she used to know. The conversation moved on to other topics, current relationships and work dramas and the best new restaurants in Fischetto. The comfortable flow of people who genuinely enjoyed each other. Marina looked around the crowded apartment, at Jessica and Alex and friends who'd stuck with her through hard times, and felt wealthy in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts or trust funds. Robert called the next morning asking how the party had been, his voice warm with parental concern disguised as casual interest. Marina told him it had been perfect, told him about Alex's plan to propose a joint woodworking project with Robert, told him she was genuinely happy for the first time in years. Her father was quiet for a moment, then said he'd known she'd be okay, had never doubted her strength even when she'd doubted it herself. He was proud of her, he said, not for leaving David necessarily, but for knowing her own worth and refusing to settle for less. They talked about Thanksgiving plans, about Robert's business expansion into the Midwest, about ordinary things that felt extraordinary because they came without judgment or expectation. Marina hung up feeling lucky, not for the trust fund or the financial security, but for the father who'd taught her to value the right things. Winter arrived early that year, Philadelphia getting its first snow in November. The city transformed into something beautiful and treacherous under its white coating. Marina and Alex bundled up for long walks through Fairmount Park, their breath visible in the cold air, their conversations ranging from practical to philosophical. Alex had met the Thorntons once before the divorce, had witnessed Patricia's condescension firsthand, and understood why Marina needed to protect their relationship from that toxicity. They talked about the future carefully, both scarred by previous relationships, both determined to build something healthier. Alex proposed in December, not with an expensive ring, but with a simple band they'd designed together at a local jeweler, asking Marina to be partners in the truest sense. She said yes, without hesitation, knowing this time she was choosing from wholeness rather than need. The wedding planning was everything Marina's first wedding hadn't been, small and intimate with only people they genuinely loved in attendance. Robert walked her down the aisle again, but this time Marina didn't feel like she was leaving one man's protection for another's. She was entering a partnership as an equal, bringing her full self, including all she'd learned from her marriage's failure. Alex's family was warm and welcoming, working-class folks from Pittsburgh who immediately connected with Robert over shared backgrounds and values. There were no designer dresses or orchestra performances. Just a community center decorated by friends, a potluck reception, and vows written from the heart. Marina looked at Alex's honest face as they promised to respect and support each other, and felt the rightness of it down to her bones. David had moved to New York by then, chasing a position at his father's firm and dating someone whose pedigree Patricia approved of wholeheartedly. Marina heard updates occasionally through Melissa, who'd become more distant from her parents as she'd developed her own life and values. Apparently, Richard had never forgiven the perceived disrespect of that October dinner, still muttering about Robert's inappropriate behavior whenever Marina's name came up. Patricia maintained Marina had been a gold digger all along. The narrative, apparently easier than admitting their own cruelty, had driven away a genuine person. Marina felt a distant pity for them, trapped in their narrow worldview. But mostly she just felt free, grateful she'd escaped before becoming calcified in the same bitter patterns. Her work at the nonprofit expanded Marina's personal experience with financial abuse and family pressure, making her particularly effective at helping others navigate similar situations. She started a support group for people leaving toxic relationships, watching participants find their strength week by week. Robert quietly funded the program's expansion, his money doing real good in a way that would have been impossible if he'd flaunted his wealth, rather than building it steadily. Marina understood now that her father's worn flannels and motor oil smell had been tests of a sort. Filters separating people who saw surfaces from those who saw substance. The Thorntons had failed that test spectacularly, had revealed themselves completely in their rush to judgment, and Marina was grateful for the lesson, even if it had been painful to learn. Years passed with the quiet accumulation of happy moments that made up a good life, Alex and Marina building something solid and satisfying. They bought a small house in the Mount Airy neighborhood, spent weekends fixing it up themselves rather than hiring contractors. Robert visited often, bringing his tools and his expertise, teaching Alex advanced carpentry techniques while Marina learned restoration methods for the home's original woodwork. They'd work all day, then collapse on the porch with beer and takeout, exhausted and content, hands dirty and hearts full. Marina thought about Patricia's horror at such activities, about how the Thorntons measured success in leisure rather than accomplishment, and felt grateful she'd escaped that empty pursuit of appearance over substance. She saw David once, by chance, at a conference both their organizations were attending in Washington, D.C., 3 years after their divorce had finalized. He looked older, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age, his expensive suit hanging on a frame that seemed diminished somehow. They exchanged polite greetings, asked surface questions about work and life, danced around anything meaningful. David mentioned his engagement to someone named Caroline. Patricia's choice Marina gathered from context, and congratulated Marina on her marriage to Alex. They parted cordially, and Marina felt nothing but relief that they'd become strangers, that the past was truly past. She called Alex that night from her hotel room, suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they'd built together. Robert's health declined gradually as he entered his 70s. Nothing dramatic, but the slow accumulation of minor issues that signaled age's steady advance. Marina, worried about him alone in rural Pennsylvania, tried to convince him to move closer to Philadelphia, but he was stubborn as always. The workshop was his life, he insisted. The work kept him young, and he'd die with grease under his fingernails rather than wasting away in some sterile retirement community. Marina visited every weekend, sometimes with Alex, sometimes alone. Savoring the time with her father and learning everything she could about the business he'd built, Robert started teaching her the larger operations, introducing her to the managers and engineers who kept his empire running while he stayed focused on the work he loved. She learned that Robert's company employed over 2,000 people across 6 states, that his emphasis on fair wages and benefits had created unusual loyalty in an industry known for high turnover. The people who worked for him spoke about Robert with genuine affection, sharing stories of his fairness and his willingness to get hands dirty alongside the newest employee. Marina understood that this was the real measure of her father's success. Not the billions in his accounts, but the lives he'd positively impacted through how he'd chosen to build and run his business. It made the Thorntons' obsession with displaying wealth seem even more pathetic, their fear of judgment keeping them trapped in elaborate performances. Robert had been free all along, had known something they'd never understand about what actually mattered in building a meaningful life. The call came on a Tuesday morning in March, Robert's manager finding him collapsed in the workshop. A heart attack, sudden and massive. Marina made the drive in a daze, Alex beside her handling logistics while she struggled to process a world without her father's steady presence. They kept him on life support long enough for her to say goodbye. Marina holding his calloused hand and thanking him for everything, for teaching her to value substance over surface, for giving her the strength to leave when staying would have slowly killed her spirit. She told him about the baby she and Alex had just learned about, the grandchild he'd never meet, and she swore that child would learn his values, would understand that worth came from character, not bank accounts. Robert's hand was warm in hers until it wasn't, and Marina felt his absence like a physical wound. The funeral was enormous. Workers from all 6 facilities taking time off to pay respects, a testament to how Robert had touched lives beyond his family. Patricia and Richard sent flowers with a card expressing condolences, their gesture feeling hollow and performative. David came, surprisingly standing in the back during the service, his face drawn with what might have been genuine grief. He'd apparently stayed in occasional contact with Robert, Marina learned later. Lunch meetings when business brought David to Philadelphia? Her father had never mentioned it, had kept David's attempts at connection private, and Marina felt her heart twist, thinking about Robert's generosity toward the man who'd hurt his daughter. After everyone else left, David approached Marina, said simply that Robert had been kind to him when he'd deserved nothing but contempt, that he was sorry for everything and hoped she was happy. Marina thanked him and meant it, grateful that her father had seen something worth nurturing, even in the son-in-law who'd failed his tests. Robert's will was straightforward. Everything to Marina with detailed instructions on how he hoped she'd manage the business and the foundation he'd been quietly running for years. The foundation funded technical education programs, helped formerly incarcerated people learn trades, supported small manufacturers trying to compete against overseas production. Marina had known nothing about it, but reading through the files, she saw her father's values expressed in systematic generosity that changed lives without requiring gratitude or recognition. She decided to step back from the nonprofit to focus on managing Robert's legacy. Both the company and the foundation worked that felt like continuing his mission rather than starting something new. Alex supported the decision completely, their life rearranging around new responsibilities while maintaining the core values that defined them. Taking over Robert's company meant learning fast. Marina suddenly responsible for thousands of employees' livelihoods and a complex operation spanning multiple states. She kept her father's management team, relied heavily on people who'd worked with Robert for decades and shared his commitment to ethical business. They were skeptical at first, wondering if the boss's daughter would maintain his principles or sell out to investors pushing for higher profits through lower wages. Marina proved herself through consistent decisions that prioritized people over short-term gains. Through her willingness to spend time on factory floors, learning operations rather than hiding in the executive office, she wore her father's old flannel to work sometimes, the shirt carrying his scent and serving as a reminder of what she was protecting. The employees noticed, understood the symbolic weight, and their initial skepticism transformed into fierce loyalty. The baby arrived in October, a daughter Marina and Alex named Robin after Robert, wanting her to carry forward his legacy in name as well as values. Marina brought Robin to the workshop as soon as she could, letting her daughter nap in the same apartment where Marina had found clarity. During her separation from David, the smell of motor oil and sawdust was Robin's lullaby, and Marina liked to think Robert's spirit lingered in those familiar scents. She told Robin stories about her grandfather, about the man who'd built an empire while staying true to himself, who'd taught Marina that real wealth came from integrity and human connection. Alex built Robin a crib from wood reclaimed from Robert's workshop, each nail driven with reverence, creating an object that connected past to future across the generations. News of Marina's position spread eventually. Business publications running profiles on the woman who'd inherited a manufacturing empire and chosen to run it herself rather than selling. Some articles mentioned her divorce from the Thornton family. The brief marriage ended before she'd known her inheritance was coming. Marina declined most interviews, uncomfortable with publicity, but she gave one to a working-class journal that wanted to feature her father's story. She talked about Robert's values, about how he'd measured success in jobs created and lives improved rather than money accumulated. The article went viral in certain circles, struck a chord with people tired of wealth, flaunted, and workers exploited. It also reached the Thorntons, Melissa told her, causing quite a stir at Richard and Patricia's country club, where people suddenly knew them as the in-laws who'd mocked a billionaire to his face. Patricia reached out again a decade after that October dinner, an email suggesting they'd all made mistakes and perhaps it was time to move past old hurts. Marina read it twice, looking for genuine remorse beneath the carefully worded non-apology, finding only the same manipulative tone she remembered. She didn't respond, had learned that some people never truly changed, that Patricia and Richard would always be more concerned with appearances than actual growth. David had apparently divorced Caroline after 2 years, was on his third marriage now, still chasing something he couldn't define. Melissa reported that he seemed unhappy in a vague way, successful on paper but hollow in person, trapped in the same patterns that had doomed their marriage. Marina felt pity mixed with relief, grateful every day that she'd had the strength to walk away when staying would have been easier. Robin grew up splitting time between the Philadelphia house and Robert's workshop, learning to use tools before she learned to read, absorbing values through example. Marina and Alex taught her the same lessons Robert had taught Marina, that worth came from character and effort, that appearances deceived and substance mattered. Robin heard stories about the dinner where her great-grandparents had mocked Robert, the night that had changed Marina's trajectory completely. The stories became family legend, teaching moments about standing up for yourself and recognizing who deserved your energy. Robin learned young that some people would judge you by your bank account or your clothes, and those people weren't worth the effort of proving anything. She learned that the best revenge was living well and treating others with the respect you'd been denied. Marina's company thrived under her leadership, growing steadily through the same principles Robert had established, treating workers fairly and building quality products that lasted. She resisted pressure from investors to maximize short-term profits, maintained the same focus on sustainability and ethical practices that had defined her father's approach. The business world often treated her like an anomaly, a woman running a manufacturing empire in a male-dominated industry. But Marina faced that condescension with the same equanimity Robert had shown the Thorntons. She knew what she was building and why, knew the lives depending on her decisions, and refused to compromise values for acceptance. The employees appreciated it, productivity and loyalty remaining high while competitors struggled with turnover and quality issues caused by treating workers as disposable. The foundation expanded under Marina's guidance, funded by the company's profits and growing Robert's vision of creating opportunity through technical education. Marina hired educators and social workers, built programs that addressed systemic barriers to employment, helped people who'd been written off by society discover valuable skills. She thought about Patricia's horror at manual labor, about the Thornton family's conviction that working with your hands was somehow lesser. The foundation existed to combat that toxic attitude, to restore dignity to skilled trades, and prove that intelligence took many forms. Every person they helped find stable employment felt like honoring Robert's memory, like continuing the mission he'd started decades ago in a small workshop that smelled of motor oil and dreams. Years accumulated into decades, Robin growing from child to teenager to young adult, carrying Robert's values into a new generation with her own innovations. She studied engineering, chose to work her way up through the company rather than accepting an executive position through family connection. Marina watched her daughter repeat the patterns Robert had established, earning respect through competence rather than demanding it through relationship. Alex's hair grayed, and so did Marina's, both of them settling into middle age with the contentment of people who'd built something meaningful together. They still lived modestly despite Marina's wealth, still found satisfaction in fixing things themselves, still measured success by the impact they had rather than the possessions they accumulated. The Thornton way of life seemed increasingly distant, a cautionary tale from another lifetime. Marina attended David's funeral when he died unexpectedly at 60. A heart attack like the one that had taken Robert, though David's came from stress rather than hard work. Patricia was elderly and diminished, Richard having passed years earlier, their fortune depleted by poor investments and expensive tastes. Caroline, the second wife, had taken much in their divorce, and the third marriage had been to someone who'd left when the money started running out. Melissa stood with Marina at the service, the two of them representing what might have been if David had chosen differently, made different priorities, built a different life. They didn't speak to Patricia, the old woman seeming not to recognize Marina anyway, dementia having stolen even the memory of her cruelty. Marina felt more sad than vindicated, seeing the emptiness of lives focused on wrong things. Grateful again that she'd escaped before becoming trapped in that same hollow pursuit. The workshop remained her sanctuary. The place Marina went when decisions weighed heavy or she needed to reconnect with the foundation of everything she'd built. She'd kept it exactly as Robert had left it, tools in their familiar places. The smell of motor oil, a comforting constant. Sometimes Robin would find her there, mother and daughter working side by side on whatever needed fixing, talking through challenges or just enjoying comfortable silence. These moments felt holy to Marina, sacred connections across generations linked by shared values and calloused hands. She'd tell Robin stories about Robert, about that October dinner that seemed like ancient history now, about the man who'd worn flannel to board meetings and never apologized for the grease under his nails. On the 20th anniversary of that dinner, Marina stood in the workshop as October light slanted through dusty windows, holding one of Robert's old flannel shirts and remembering 20 years since Patricia had wrinkled her nose and Richard had muttered about respect and hygiene, 20 years since she'd watched her father absorb their contempt with patient grace, knowing something they'd never understand. That night had felt catastrophic at the time, her marriage imploding and her future uncertain, but Marina could trace every good thing in her current life back to the clarity it had forced. She'd learned to trust her instincts, to demand respect, to build a life aligned with actual values rather than performed ones. The lesson had been brutal but necessary, and she was grateful for it, even as she mourned the pain it had caused. Robin found her there as sunset painted the workshop gold, asked what she was thinking about with such serious expression. Marina told her about the dinner, about watching her in-laws mock Robert, about the sick feeling of silence while someone she loved was insulted. She told Robin about the choice she'd faced afterward, about David's promises and her own uncertainty, about the long road to trusting herself enough to leave. Her daughter listened with the intensity of someone learning essential truths, understanding that this story was part of her inheritance too. Marina explained that Robert's billions mattered less than the example he'd set, that the real gift was learning to value yourself enough to walk away from people who didn't value you. Robin hugged her tight, and Marina felt the continuity of lessons passing down. Robert's wisdom living on through the choices his descendants made. The company thrived into its next generation, Robin taking on more responsibility as Marina gradually stepped back, the natural cycle of succession playing out. They maintained Robert's principles, refusing to sacrifice worker welfare for investor profits, building products that lasted rather than planned obsolescence. The business world often treated them like anachronisms, but the numbers proved the approach worked. Loyal employees producing quality goods that commanded premium prices. Marina took pride in proving that ethical business could be profitable business, that Robert's way wasn't just nostalgia but a viable model for success. Every quarterly report showing sustainable growth felt like vindication, proof that the Thornton values of extraction and exploitation weren't the only path to wealth. Patricia died alone in a nursing facility, none of her country club friends maintaining contact once her money ran out. A sad ending to a life focused on wrong things. Marina attended the funeral out of respect for what might have been, standing in the back while a sparse crowd mourned. Melissa delivered the eulogy, honest about their mother's faults while acknowledging her own complicated grief. Afterward, the sisters went to dinner at a diner Patricia would have scorned, eating meatloaf and talking about how different their lives had become from the one their parents had envisioned. Melissa had built a successful therapy practice, specialized in helping people recover from toxic family systems, her own upbringing providing unfortunate expertise. They laughed about the irony, about Patricia's horror if she'd known her daughter made a living helping people escape environments exactly like the one she'd created. Marina entered her 70s, much as Robert had. Still working though, her role had shifted to mentoring rather than managing, still finding satisfaction in being useful. The trust fund Robert had established had grown substantially. Smart management turning $5 million into $50 over the decades, though Marina had never touched the principal. She used the interest to fund scholarships to support small businesses, to help people who needed a hand up rather than hand out. Alex was still beside her, their partnership having weathered decades and emerged stronger, built on respect and shared values rather than romance and appearance. They'd grown old together, hands weathered by work and hearts full of memories. The life they'd created more satisfying than anything either had imagined in their youth. Robin announced her engagement to someone Marina instantly liked, a woman named Sam who worked in renewable energy and cared deeply about environmental justice. The wedding was simple and joyful, held at the workshop where Robert's spirit felt most present. Three generations gathering to celebrate love built on substance rather than show. Marina watched Robin exchange vows with Sam, saw the respect and equality in how they looked at each other, and felt grateful that her daughter had learned the lessons well. There would be no Patricia figure in Robin's marriage. Number toxic in-laws teaching the wrong values, just two families who appreciated what actually mattered. The reception featured potluck contributions and homemade decorations. Laughter and dancing late into the October night, exactly the kind of celebration Robert would have loved. As Marina entered her final years, she felt satisfied with the life she'd built from the ashes of that dinner to decades past. Grateful for the painful catalyst that had forced necessary change. She'd lost a marriage, but gained herself. Had inherited billions, but learned that real wealth came from integrity and human connection. Robert's legacy lived on through the company and foundation, through the thousands of lives improved by his principled approach to business. Through his daughter's determination to honor his values, the Thorntons had faded into footnotes, remembered only as examples of what to avoid, their cruelty serving a purpose they'd never intended by teaching Marina exactly who she didn't want to become. Every choice she'd made since that October evening had been influenced by the contrast between their empty performance and Robert's genuine substance. Marina died peacefully at 78, surrounded by family in the house she and Alex had rebuilt together. Her last words thanking him for their shared journey. Robin inherited everything, prepared by decades of mentoring to steward the family legacy into the future. The funeral filled a cathedral. Workers and community members and scholarship recipients gathering to honor a woman who'd touched thousands of lives through quiet generosity. Sam delivered the eulogy, talking about Marina's commitment to dignity and fairness, about how she'd built a life aligned with values learned from a father who'd worn flannel to formal dinners and never apologized for honest work. In the crowd sat elderly people who'd been given second chances through the foundation, young people whose education had been funded by scholarships, workers whose lives had been made better by a company that treated them as humans rather than resources. This was Marina's true inheritance, not the money but the impact, not the billions but the lives improved through principled choices made day after day for decades. Robin kept the workshop as a museum of sorts, preserving Robert's tools and Marina's additions, maintaining the space where three generations had learned the lessons that defined them. She brought her own children there, told them stories about Robert and Marina, about the dinner where mockery had revealed character and set destinies. The stories became family mythology, teaching moments about standing firm in your values and recognizing that some people's opinions weren't worth the energy of proving anything. The workshop smelled perpetually of motor oil and sawdust, familiar scents that connected past to present, reminding everyone who entered that real wealth came from what you built rather than what you accumulated. Sometimes Robin would sit alone there, tools in hand, and feel the presence of those who'd taught her everything, grateful for the legacy they'd left. The company thrived for another generation under Robin's leadership, adapting to changing times while maintaining core principles, proving that Robert's approach wasn't tied to any era but represented timeless truths about treating people fairly. Sam brought environmental focus to the operations, pushing for sustainability practices that reduced impact while increasing efficiency. Innovations that would have made Robert proud. Together they expanded the foundation's reach, funded programs addressing climate change and economic justice, tackled systemic issues Marina had only begun to address. The billions Robert had built and Marina had stewarded continued growing, but more importantly, they continued serving. Resources deployed strategically to improve lives and create opportunity. This was the real revenge on people like the Thorntons. Not proving anything to them, but building something meaningful they'd never understand. Years after Marina's death, a journalist writing a book about American manufacturing wanted to profile the company Robert had built and its unusual commitment to worker welfare. Robin agreed to an interview, brought the journalist to the workshop, told the family stories while showing Robert's tools and Marina's additions. She talked about the October dinner that had started everything, about Patricia and Richard's contempt for appearances they didn't understand, about how that cruelty had paradoxically led to Marina finding herself and building something beautiful. The journalist wanted to make the Thorntons villains, but Robin resisted that simple narrative, explaining that they'd been trapped in their own limited worldview, unable to see past surfaces to substance. Their judgments said more about their poverty than Robert's wealth, revealed emptiness where they'd thought they had sophistication. The real story wasn't revenge or triumph, but the persistent power of lived values across generations. The book became a bestseller, resonating with people tired of wealth, flaunted, and workers exploited. Offering Robert's model as alternative to extraction capitalism, Robin found herself unexpectedly thrust into spotlight. Invited to conferences and interviews, asked to explain how ethical business actually worked. She told Robert's story, and Marina's talked about that pivotal dinner and the choices that had flowed from it. Emphasized that treating people with dignity was good business as well as good ethics. The company received thousands of applications from people wanting to work somewhere that valued them. The publicity making Robert's approach seem aspirational rather than anachronistic. Robin stayed humble through it all, knew the attention would fade, focused on the daily work of maintaining the legacy she'd inherited and adding her own innovations for the next generation to build upon. In her 80s, Robin sat in the workshop as October light slanted through windows, holding one of Robert's old flannel shirts exactly as Marina had done decades before. She thought about the long arc of the family story, about how one evening's cruelty had revealed essential truths and set different destinies. Robert had taught Marina, and Marina had taught Robin, that worth came from character, not appearance, that real wealth meant impact, not accumulation. 3 generations had built something meaningful from those lessons, had proved repeatedly that the Thornton way wasn't the only way, that ethical choices could compound across decades into extraordinary results. The shirt still smelled faintly of motor oil after all these years, a scent Robin associated with love and wisdom and the kind of strength that didn't need to prove anything. She held it close and felt grateful, not for the billions but for the values. Not for what they'd inherited, but for what they'd become.